Warning, the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts and injury. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Chelsea Hayes, Part 1.
Well, Wendy, why don't you tell the listeners and our audience what they're going to hear in these next two episodes that we have to offer?
Okay, David. This case is a 2012 murder of a 14-year-old victim by the name of Chelsea Hayes. Took place in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And as you know, we went down to interview the lead detective that worked that case. That's Lieutenant Daniel Francis. And this case had me on the edge of my seat from the moment Daniel started talking. And after the interview was finished, I was still sitting there scratching my head, trying to just wrap my mind around the whole thing. What about you? What captivated you in it?
I think pretty much the same thing as you. First of all, I was so impressed with Daniel and how articulate he is and very detailed. The listeners will catch that as well. The other thing, too, is that this case is going to demonstrate the power of observation, the importance of detectives and investigators and police officers using their intuition, because they're going to find out as they listen that they knew something was wrong at this scene. And I'm not going to go any more detail and spoil it because it's actually pretty interesting in that aspect, too. Those are the things that caught me. The other thing on both episodes is for people to listen, because one of the concepts of the Murder Police podcast is to go beyond just the case details. You can watch the news for that. When we talk to these people that actually do the job, and Daniel does an excellent job of this in this case, we want the detectives to get their heart into this. So we hear the passion for the job, and then we also hear what it's like to actually do the work. And that's going to be a special treat for people, especially when Daniel talks about some of the things he did.
Yeah, and I would like to add, the irony in this case is that it started out with a missing child call. That's what the call went out as. And if our audience has listened to any of our other podcasts, they will learn that the Haley McCone case went out also as a missing child, and then she was subsequently murdered by a serial killer. So there's a lot of similarity in these two. Haley was 13, Chelsea was 14. They both were reported missing. They both were murdered. So, with that being said, I think we should dig right in.
Let's go.
Today, Murder Police Podcast has come down to Chattanooga to meet with Daniel. Daniel, thank you so much for inviting us down and taking your time to talk with us.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Daniel?
My name is Daniel Francis. I'm a lieutenant with the Chattanooga Police Department. I've served with Chattanooga PD for a little over 14 years at this point. I'm a third-generation police officer. My grandfather served as a reserve officer up in the state of Michigan. My father actually joined the Chattanooga Police Department when I was about 4 years old and worked his way up through the ranks and even spent a bit of time in homicide. And I grew to just love the investigative side of police work through that. And I joined and ended up in homicide after about 6 years of service in the patrol division.
Is that about normal? How much time does an officer usually spend in Chattanooga before they go to a specialized assignment?
That's a little quick. It's normally you're eligible for a specialized assignment after 3 years, but homicide specifically takes a little bit longer to get there. Our department's about 500 people, so there's several different opportunities that you have to do specialty investigations. I mean, there's traffic, there's canine, there's a whole list of things. But to get over into homicide, it's normally around 10, 12 years. Some people maybe 8. Thankfully, I was able to get in right around the 6-year mark.
Can I take you back to your dad a little, because that's fascinating. Do you remember growing up watching him do the work, and did that play a role in your interest in this kind of work?
Absolutely. When I was 12, Dad took me to my first autopsy, and it was a case where a guy got robbed. And as the robber was walking away, he said, "I know who you are. I'm going to get even." And the guy turned around and just fired one shot in his direction and hit him square in the chest and killed him. And Dad took me to that autopsy at the age of 12. I can remember another time when, of all things, I was on my way to a church youth activity, and Dad got a phone call, and he's like, "Well, I can drop you off at this youth activity, or you can go to me with the scene of this DOA they just found." Like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm going to the scene. Now, I wasn't allowed inside the scene, but I could sit inside his car, right there on the perimeter of the scene, and got to watch all the work that was done. I was probably about 16 around that time, and just found it absolutely fascinating.
That's incredible. And I love my dad, but when I was 12, I think the most we did was go swimming. So that, nothing on Dad, but that's an incredible thing. So did you ever watch him bring work home and work on it?
Absolutely. Case files would come home. There were even times when I would go to the office and hang out with him. I can remember not so much when he was in homicide, but when he was on specialty details, if they were having break-ins or things like that. I can remember meeting him out in the field, eating dinner. Kind of just the family would go out and see him because he couldn't always make it home. When he did make it home, like I said, when he was in investigations, he would bring those case files home and go through them. Before he went to homicide, he was in the property crimes division. And so when he was there, he would teach us how to lift fingerprints and how to do all kinds of stuff that most people don't really get to do. And it was just an amazing experience to have that. And it really developed my interest in investigations. So once I got on the police department, it became a goal of mine to get into an investigative unit. And for me personally, homicide was kind of the pinnacle of the investigative units, because there are very few things that are worse than a homicide. One of the only other things I can think of are some of the sex-based crimes where the victim's left living. But ultimately, with homicides, I felt like I was going after real criminals, real bad guys, people that really needed to be in jail and taken off the streets and make society a better place.
That's interesting, because a lot of people don't understand that it's work you actually always take home, literally. And it was that way when I was in my unit. I still remember a quick story about kids in the house is that I was at trial one time, and I had my murder book on a stand, and we were going through the notes and going through an interview, and I flipped a page, and my daughter Brooke had scribbled and doodled for the next 17 pages, which was hard to keep a straight face in trial because it was unicorns and fairies and flowers and things like that. So we do actually bring that home. Speaking of family, tell us a little bit about your home life.
My wife and I have been married for 17 years. We're coming up on 18 years in March. And we have 5 children with a 6th one on the way.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So we have a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, 9-year-old, 7-year-old, 3-year-old, and another one due in June.
How exciting.
No kidding. A busy guy. A busy guy.
Mom. What do you mean a busy guy?
Well, true. Yeah, she probably has some role in that, I'm sure.
I jokingly tell her that what she has to do is more difficult than what I've ever had to do at work.
I'll go along with that.
You better believe it.
All teasing aside, I'll go along with that.
You better believe it.
Well, with that said, too, is that give us an idea what this case is about, who the victim is, and just a quick overview, a flyover.
It all started with a missing 14-year-old. It was originally reported as a runaway, and eventually it ends up culminating in us locating unidentified DOA, or dead on arrival. The identification process, interviews of the potential suspect and some other people around the case, and then finally with a plea deal for the conviction for the murder of the 14-year-old.
Before we get into it, did you notice a lot with yourself as far as your perspective on dealing with a child victim compared to an adult victim? Was it emotionally, is that more challenging for you?
Absolutely. I think this was at the time that I was in homicide. Currently, I got promoted and moved out. So at the time I was in homicide, we also handled rape cases as well as homicides. We have since split that up, and we have a sex crimes unit, and then we have a violent crimes unit. So this was probably the second hardest case I had to deal with. And I don't mean this in a callous way. sometimes when you show up, the victim had made bad choices, which led to their demise. And as difficult as it is to see someone passed away, you can kind of understand what transpired and led to that. With the 14-year-old, even though bad decisions are made, it is very hard to deal with emotionally the fact that she passed away because of her decisions.
There's always a sense of genuine innocence. I believe that too, because of that young age. Well, let's talk about her then a little bit. What do we know about the victim? What's her name, and what about her in her life before she passed?
So Chelsea Hayes is her name. She was 14 years old, and she went to one of our local high schools. Now, she did have a 15-month-old baby. He was a boy, and she was still living with her mom and grandmother at the time. And just very active, had a ton of friends. People at her school absolutely loved her. And that you would see that play out in the days after she passed away, just between the Facebook postings and all the stuff that the friends did to gather around the family.
So tell us, Daniel, what happened when this came out? You said initially as a missing child. What were you doing when that call came out, and how did it turn from missing child to murder victim?
It was Saturday, May 12th, 2012. There was a call into the police department about a runaway child. The patrol officers responded and took the initial report. This had happened previously, so the mother wasn't overly concerned with the fact that she was missing. Later that afternoon, Chelsea would call her mother to tell her that she would be returning home that evening. So her mom called back into the police department and let them know that she had made contact with her and that everything was okay. That night, she never returned home. So her mom called back into the police department to let us know that she had failed to return home. The next day was Sunday, May 13th, 2012, and that was actually Mother's Day. So at about 8:04 p.m., I was working and heard over the radio that there was a call of a distressed party. And when patrol got on the scene, they actually got on the radio and advised that it wasn't a distressed party, that it was a deceased party. And I was working with another investigator. I was paired with him. And so I called him, and we ended up calling the patrol officer. And the patrol officer is on the phone. He says, look, I don't know exactly what happened, but the story we're being told by the people at this residence does not match what's going on here. And there was the call came out that this party had come up and said she didn't feel good, sat down on the front porch, and they don't know what happened. And the officers arrived to find Chelsea sitting on the front porch, and she was deceased. We responded to the scene. We got there, and upon examining the house to kind of give you a visual idea, there were some steps you would walk up, and then they had a covered front porch. And looking at the house from the street, on the left side of the porch, there was a wicker love seat. And Chelsea was sitting in that love seat right outside the front door. She was sitting in the chair, and she had bruising on her neck and on her cheek, as well as blood running from the corner of her mouth. But the blood was running up toward her forehead. And so it appeared that she had been staged in that chair. Because if she was sitting in that chair and passed away, the blood would come out of the corner of her mouth and run down her chin because she was sitting upright. We went inside, and as we entered the residence, there were 3 or 4 boys in the living room, but they were playing video games. And one of those boys that was playing video games was our suspect, Carlos Harrison. So we separated everybody in the house and began to talk to everybody individually to ask them what they knew about what was going on. And I talked to the suspect's mother, and she advised me that this girl, she didn't know who she was, came up, knocked on their door, and had asked her for a cup of water and if she could sit down because she didn't feel well. And there was even a cup of water staged outside by the body as well. She said she came, sat down, and passed away. She didn't know what happened. And at that point, we'd already had everybody separated. I instructed the patrol officer there at the scene to call for additional cars because we were going to transport everybody individually down to the main service center to conduct interviews. What I was being told did not match what the evidence on the front porch was, and it appeared that they had already put some sort of story together about what took place. So from the time we arrived, I wanted to make sure everybody stayed separate so they couldn't collude anymore on their story. And if we were able to kind of chip away at anybody's story and gain more information, I didn't want that shared amongst everybody that was there. So we began to kind of separate people out and take them out the back door. So the front of the house is completely locked down. Nobody's going in and or out the front door at this point. So we took everybody out the back door. There was an alley that ran behind the house, and patrol cars could pull up. We could walk people out, put them in the back of the patrol car, have them transported down to the main service center. And at that point, we'd keep everybody separate inside the service center and conduct interviews. As I went to walk past the suspect's mother again, she put her finger in my chest incredibly hard. She actually bruised my chest, but she mouthed, "I need to talk to you." And so as I took her outside and went to put her in a car, she was seen going outside, with everybody else. She says, "Oh, I forgot my charging cable for my phone. Can you walk me back inside to get my charging cable?" So as we entered the rear of the house, I actually had a small digital recorder, and I turned it on and to capture our conversation. She receives a phone call as we're walking in the house, and she tells the person on the other end of the line, quote, "I ain't lying to this man anymore," end quote. And as I begin to talk to her, she tells me that the story was made up, that the suspect, Carlos, asked her to lie, and he's the one that provided the story. Chelsea did, in fact, come home with Carlos the night before. Said around midnight, between midnight and 2 a.m., sometime in that time frame, Chelsea came home with Carlos. Then she went to bed about 2 a.m., and when she woke up, Chelsea was already deceased and on the front porch.
Well, that's a big break early in that, because up to that point, even though you identified Carlos as a suspect, I don't think you all probably had anything other than suspicions that it was the scene wasn't making sense, I suppose. What would have it looked like if you hadn't learned that? What do you think some of the possibilities of where that case would have been, or if you hadn't had information like that in the beginning?
So some of the stuff we actually did after identifying him as the main suspect, it's kind of similar to what we would have done if we didn't have a suspect. So we end up with the medical examiner coming out, and they go through all of their litany of things on their checklist that they document. And as we move toward the autopsy phase, we do things like take samples, all kinds of different swabs from different parts of the body, fingernail clippings, looking for that DNA. And we send all of that stuff off for DNA. And then we did in this case, and we would anyways, is swab everybody there at the house and anybody else that was identified as being at the house during the time we knew she was there to see if we could possibly get a DNA match. And there actually ended up being some Facebook postings that would help us out as well, where the suspect posted on Facebook saying, this was about 2-3 hours before the police were even called, saying that there was some girl on his porch that was knocked out and he didn't know what was wrong with her. And then while we were on the front porch, before we separated him from his phone, he had made another post saying that she was dead when the patrol officers had arrived and said that she was passed away. So those types of things are what initially led us to go, there's something here that doesn't add up. But if those things hadn't happened, we'd still go down that DNA route. We're going to look for fingerprints. We're going to look for, if any neighbors have any type of camera systems, and just collect as much information that we can as fast as we can.
So while you're having these people transported down to your main facility, was protocol that you will call the coroner and they come and retrieve Chelsea's body, or what did you all do to maintain that crime scene at that point?
So the patrol officers that initially arrive, they'll put up crime scene tape and they will hold the perimeter. And we actually have a log that lists everyone that comes in and out of the crime scene. And we try to limit that to only people that absolutely need to come in and out of the crime scene. Initially, when they arrive, there may be a few more people that come and go until we figure out what's kind of going on. Once you realize, oh, she's passed away, I mean, they'll lock that down because you want as few people in and out of that scene as possible because you don't want any cross-contamination. Like I said, if we didn't have a suspect, we're going to look for the DNA. Even with a suspect, you're still looking at DNA. Any level of cross-contamination can absolutely ruin a case. And so you want to limit the amount of cross-contamination that can take place. So we lock everything down. We notify the coroner's office, and the coroner or the medical examiner here, they have investigators that initially come out to the scene, and they work directly with us. And we have a crime scene unit as well. Our crime scene unit, our homicide unit, and the medical examiner investigator team, we all work together. Investigators kind of take a step back, and the medical examiner investigator and the crime scene unit work to document everything around the scene. One of the really neat things that we have, and we've had it for years, is we have a laser that will take measurements, and it actually takes, thousands and thousands of measurements, and it renders a 3D model of the crime scene. And so they will set that up and begin that LiDAR scan of the entire area of the scene before anything is picked up or moved. And that can take a little time, but what that does is when we go to court and we go to testify about anything, we can actually put a 3D model of the crime scene the way we found it up for the court to see. And that's immensely valuable. There is something to actual photos, but to be able to render a 3D with exact measurements of where evidence is, where bullet holes are, where shell casings are, or anything like that is pretty neat to see.
Much more accurate than a typical crime scene sketch that was done for years. And I'd argue those could take a lot longer than LiDAR could.
Yeah. When you all, and that's really impressive. And like you say, it lends to being able to see. Then the pictures, of course, they're helpful, but seeing that in that 3D is really, I'd not heard of that. So that's really, really impressive. That
I'll find some examples and I'll put that in the show notes so the listeners can get an idea of what that looks like, because it is pretty fascinating.
So when you're out there with Chelsea, the victim, was there blood evidence around? Did you see something of a struggle or of a horrible crime? You mentioned there was blood trailing up, which is indicative of she had been laying down for it to trail up. Did you see any of that evidence, or inside, was there tons of blood in places?
No, we did not locate much evidence inside at all. Kind of to back up just a little bit, when we initially arrived, we weren't sure of her identity. We hadn't put two and two together initially of the runaway and the homicide victim. We felt strongly that it could be the runaway, but we didn't know for sure. It wouldn't be till a couple hours later that we would get an actual positive identification on who the victim was. Working from that angle, we were working with an unknown victim. The majority of the evidence we had is just what was on the front porch. Looking inside, the house wasn't incredibly neat, but it didn't look like a major struggle took place. Visually, we couldn't see any blood or anything. And there wasn't a lot of blood on her. It was just one looked like one drop of blood had come from the corner of her mouth and had run up and stopped near the top of her forehead. But you could clearly see the direction of travel on that blood, and it was running up from the position she was in.
So the coroner comes, you mentioned that you wouldn't find out for a couple of hours later a positive identity on her. So when you figure out that this is in fact her, what happens at that point? Is your suspect and the other remaining people that was in the household, are they still being interviewed, or what's happening in those back scenes?
So we had completed the interviews by the time we make the identification. Once the coroner and everybody's at the scene documenting that, one of the homicide investigators will stay at the scene with them and the crime scene unit, as well as uniformed officers holding the perimeter. At least 2, sometimes 3 more homicide investigators will go back to the main service center in order to conduct the interviews.
Had they called her by name, the suspect, Carlos, or his mother? Did they use the name Chelsea, or did they just indicate that they didn't know who she was, despite them finally admitting she had been in the house?
So they told us that she mumbled a name, and they thought it could be Chelsea or Chastity, or they weren't exactly sure. They gave us a list of several different names that started with C, but that she had mumbled it before she passed out when she walked up and didn't feel good, is initially what we were told. By the time when we were told that, and we were able to get with missing persons and tell them, hey, we have these possible names, I mean, immediately this is who we believe it is. One of the hindrances in IDing her was the fact that when she left home, she actually left in the middle of the night, and her mom did not know what she was wearing. So when she left home, the next morning, her mom woke up to the sound of the baby crying, and she went into the room to see why the baby was crying and realized that Chelsea had left. So she had no idea what she was wearing. So we had a name. At this point, we had a name, a date of birth, but we didn't have any other identifiable features about her. Being 14, she didn't have an ID. We didn't have anything else to look for. And so we were actually able to make the identification, the positive identification, from her clothing. We were able to share pictures of her clothing with her family, and they confirmed this is in fact her clothes. These clothes are in fact missing from her bedroom, and that's actually how we made the positive identification. So that's part of the reason when I say we didn't know who she was. We had a really good idea who she was, but I'm really leery to say this is in fact the person until we get that confirmation from the family. And so that took a little bit longer than it does in a normal instance. So while all of that was going on, we continued to conduct interviews. We interviewed the suspect's mother, her boyfriend, and I mean, he was really straightforward. As soon as he sat down, he just flat said, yeah, Carlos asked me to lie, and I'm not going to. He said, I was here last night. She came home with him. I went to bed. I got up at 9 o'clock and went to work. Everybody else in the house was asleep. When I came home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she was on the front porch. And I went upstairs and asked, my girlfriend, the suspect's mother, what's going on with this? And so there was some indication that she had been on the porch for several hours before 911 was called.
Did any neighbors report having seen them carry her out to the porch?
No neighbors reported having seen them carry her. One neighbor across the street during the neighborhood canvass would report just seeing her on the porch. Wasn't sure how she got there and wasn't sure how long she was there, but did remember seeing her there for a while.
So because you mentioned that the boyfriend went to work at 9, and I'm guessing she was still in the home at that point. And
Yes.
then when he comes home some, hours later at 5 in the afternoon, because that's a pretty brazen thing to do in broad daylight, pack her out and position her there. I guess I would think that many people would see the goings on of that, but in this case, you said it didn't. So you have the people down, you're interviewing, victim's already been identified, family knows what's going on. And what happens at that point?
Well, then we interview the suspect. And as we interview the suspect, he initially gives us the same story that his mother gave us, which was the absolute lie. So we let him continue with that lie all the way through. In many cases, if they're not going to tell me the whole truth, I'd rather them lie to me, because that is just as powerful when it comes to testimony as telling the entire truth. And so we let him finish his lie, and then we confront him and basically tell him, we don't exactly know what happened, but we know that that is not what happened. So then he alters his story just a little bit to where, okay, I did in fact bring her home with me. We had consensual sex. She left after sex, came back later the next day, and then died on my porch. And so we kind of challenged him on that story as well. And then he kind of changed his story to, oh, well, okay, she came home with me. We had consensual sex. We woke up the next morning. Everything was fine. I went out, made some breakfast, played some video games, came back and found her dead on the floor. I don't know what happened. I'm like, yeah. And we challenged him on that story again. We're like, yeah, I don't think that's exactly what happened either. And then we actually showed him a picture of her from sitting on the front porch. And he looked away and gave us some expletives and said, okay, I ain't lying no more. This is what happened. I was in East Lake and she came up with a couple other guys. We got to talking. We hit it off. Asked her if she wanted to come home with me. She said yes. We went home. We hung out for a couple of hours. Mom had some friends over. They were watching basketball. Brothers were playing some video games. And everybody went to bed. We went to bed. We had consensual sex. And then I left her and let her sleep in my bedroom by herself. And I went right outside the bedroom door and slept on the couch. And we asked him to clarify if there was anyone else that was with her. He said, no, absolutely not. Was there even a possibility? No, absolutely not. So, but when I came in to the bedroom the next morning, I found her shaking in the floor and didn't know what to do. So I got my 11-year-old brothers and my 8-year-old brother, and we moved her to the front porch and realized we had left some articles of clothing in my room. So we moved her back into my room, put the articles of clothing back on her, moved her back out to the front porch, and left her. And that was his ultimately that was the final version of his testimony, which isn't exactly what we believed happened, but it was pretty close. The
Probably as close as you were going to get.
Well, it was as close as we were going to get because during the autopsy phase, it was clear that the sex was not consensual. So he ends up getting charged with 3 counts of rape in connection with the murder for 3 different acts that we were able to prove took place because of the evidence gained at the autopsy.
Did you attend the autopsy?
Yes, I did.
Is there anything you can share about that without going into too much graphic detail as to what those charges were based on?
It was based on blood evidence, bruising in different areas of the body, and as well as DNA evidence that we were able to collect. She was beat up pretty bad. She had, the medical examiner described it almost like shaken baby syndrome. Where there was bleeding all over her brain and her vocal cords were severed from screaming so loud. And she had bruising around her neck and bruising on her cheek. Initially, my initial thought was she was probably strangled. However, the medical examiner listed her cause of death as blunt force trauma from all the bleeding that was on her brain.
Any indication of a weapon or a mark, or do you think it was just a open hand or a closed fist or something? Or
we never found any indication, and as well as we never found any evidence in the bedroom either.
And I guess when you were interviewing him, he hadn't indicated putting any of these wounds on her, strangling her, choking her, hitting her in the head, just nothing. He
said multiple times when specifically asked, where did the bruising come from? He said multiple times, I have no idea. She wasn't like that when I left her in my bedroom. I came in and found her like that. I don't know what happened. And that's part of the reason why we kind of pushed him on, could someone else have come in? And no, absolutely not. And to kind of get back to that DNA, we did collect his DNA out of the victim. So he left DNA behind in the victim. So even the entire part about the sex being consensual, and he even specifically told us it was protected, that he had used a condom, and he told us even how he threw the condom wrapper away and how he threw the condom away, kind of one of those where I flushed it down the toilet, you can't find it type incidents. Even that part of his testimony wasn't true because we collected his semen out of the victim.
Wow. And to think that he recruited his younger brothers, some 8 and 11-year-olds, to partake in positioning her, that blows my mind. But aside of that, you mentioned her throat where she had screamed so loud. Did no neighbors or the mom or boyfriend, no one claimed hearing that screaming?
Nobody said that they heard anything. And even when confronted with that, they still held to their claim that they didn't hear anything.
And there's no other logical reason as to what would cause that injury aside of that. It wasn't strangulation.
Now, it was the medical examiner's opinion that it was from screaming. There was also markings in the back of her throat as well from screaming as well. If you scream really, really, really loud, you can actually damage the back of your throat as well as your vocal cords. And she had all of that evidence present.
Wow. So do you all make an arrest of him after that interview, or does some time go on before you have enough evidence to make an arrest?
Let me jump before we get there too. During the interview, what was his demeanor, and was he just being responsive, or did he ask you all questions? Did you get an impression that he was trying to figure out, was he running counterintelligence on you? Because some of them will do that. Was he inquisitive at all? What was his demeanor?
So, like I said, from the time we got to the scene, he was sitting right inside the door playing video games, and so his demeanor was pretty relaxed, pretty nonchalant about the entire thing. And I mean, I can tell you it's the image is seared into my memory. They were playing a basketball game on their PlayStation. I can remember that specifically because when I walked in the house, I just thought, how can you be so callous as to be here playing a video game when there's a 14-year-old passed away on your front porch, not 10 feet from where you're sitting? And that attitude pretty much carried on through the first initial interviews until we showed him the picture of her. When we showed him the picture of her is when his demeanor changed. He let out some expletives and he looked away and he wouldn't even look at the picture anymore. And that's when we got the closest version to the truth that I felt like we were going to get.
Did he at any time in that interview say why? I guess I'm just puzzled by this, that if you were, and I know initially he was saying that they just randomly found the girl on the porch, and we know that's not true, but how do you go about just playing a game or even just sitting inside your house if you were to stumble on someone? I think if we were to walk out where we live and find someone on our porch, there would be all kinds of hysteria, and you're screaming and you're freaked out and you're not wanting to get off the phone with dispatch until somebody gets there, because who is this and how in the world did they get there? But to go inside and play a game and everybody's just going on like business as usual, I guess, do they not think that alone would throw up so many red flags?
It was very unusual, and that's one of the reasons we felt like the suspect was pretty close to what was going on in proximity, because it was just so unusual, the response to what had happened. And to give you some insight to exactly what you're talking about, she had been put on the front porch hours earlier. It wasn't until the suspect's aunt came by to visit that 911 would get called. The suspect's aunt comes by, and the suspect walks out to the car and says, "Hey, Auntie, you have to see this." And she thought he was referring to some pit bulls. They would breed pit bulls. So she thought, well, maybe their dog had a litter of puppies. She said as soon as she got out of the car and saw Chelsea on the front porch, she knew she was deceased.
Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. This podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.